"Dad, get out before my wife gets home." Those were the exact words my son said to me right in front of my own grandchildren. He looked down at the faded, oilskin duster coat I was wearing, glanced briefly at the flat manila envelope clutched in my calloused hand, and immediately assumed he knew exactly why I had shown up on his doorstep. In his mind, I was nothing more than a financial drain, a broken-down relic of the past who had finally come to beg for a handout or a warm place to sleep. He thought I had finally become the embarrassing burden he had spent years telling everyone I was. I didn't argue with him. I didn't try to explain the urgency of the papers in my hand. I simply looked him in the eyes, placed the brown envelope on the small slate table in his grand foyer, and turned back toward the howling wind. Before walking away, I stopped on the stone step and looked back over my shoulder. "Leo," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the heavy weight of 40 years of hard labor. "Read page 4 before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Welcome back to Whispered Truths. Grab a glass of water, pull up a chair, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every single opportunity to do the right thing. They simply chose wrong." Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can begin our story, and hit that like button, because I believe you're going to find this journey incredibly satisfying. My name is Garrett Vance. I am 68 years old, and I spent more than 35 years of my life running a small, custom commercial shipbuilding yard on the rugged banks of the Chesapeake Bay in Annapolis, Maryland. These hands of mine are rough, deeply lined with the permanent stains of marine grease, calloused from handling heavy oak timbers, rough fiberglass, and heavy iron rigging. I know what a solid seaworthy foundation looks like. I know how to build a vessel that can take the brutal slamming of an Atlantic gale and come out unscathed. And unfortunately, I also know exactly how a structure collapses when the tiny, creeping cracks in its foundation are ignored. That evening, a freezing, dense coastal fog was rolling in off the water, bringing with it a bitter, biting drizzle that stung the skin. I had driven my old dark green 1999 Dodge Ram 1500 to my son's house. That truck had been my loyal companion through hundreds of marine construction projects. It wasn't shiny. Its paint was faded, its tailgate was dented, and the steel toolboxes in the bed were scratched and rusted, but it was paid off entirely with money I earned through my own sweat, blood, and honest work. I stood outside Leo's house, feeling the chill of the damp air seep into my bones. His home was a magnificent, multi-million-dollar modern estate built of glass, steel, and imported stone, perched high on a cliff overlooking the bay. Through the massive, double-height glass windows, the grand chandeliers inside cast a warm golden glow across the manicured lawn. I could see a lively family gathering underway. There was an abundance of expensive food, the glint of crystal wine glasses, and the sound of laughter drifting through the heavy oak double doors. My 11-year-old granddaughter, Chloe, was sitting at the massive mahogany dining table, laughing as she spoke to her mother-in-law. I knocked firmly on the heavy door, my hand holding that flat brown envelope. When the door swung open, Leo stood there. He was 29 years old, wearing a tailored Italian shirt, with a gleaming six-figure Swiss watch reflecting the warm light of the foyer. He looked me up and down, and I watched his eyes stop on my old canvas duster, which was stained with a bit of salt spray and marine sealant. Then his gaze drifted past me toward the old Dodge Ram parked along the neat brick-paved curb. His expression darkened instantly, a flash of pure annoyance and embarrassment crossing his handsome features. He didn't invite me inside. He didn't even open the door fully, keeping his body positioned to block my view of the living room. "What are you doing here, Dad?" Leo asked, his voice low and dripping with irritation. "I came to talk to you, Leo," I replied. My voice remained calm, steady. I was used to working with rough, loud shipbuilding crews in the middle of raging storms. I wasn't in the habit of shouting or losing my temper unless it was absolutely necessary. Leo glanced quickly back into his living room. His mother-in-law, Victoria, a haughty socialite draped in silk and diamonds, was sitting on the plush designer sofa. His sister, Maeve, and his children were there too, enjoying the warmth. Leo took a deep, theatrical breath, the irritation showing clearly in the deep crease that formed across his forehead. "Not tonight, Dad," he growled, trying to keep his voice down so the guests wouldn't hear. "It will only take 5 minutes, Leo," I said, holding the envelope out toward him. Leo didn't take it. Instead, he pushed my hand away with a sharp, dismissive swipe. His thin thread of patience snapped completely, and he raised his voice, loud enough for the entire living room to fall into a sudden, suffocating silence. "Dad, get out before my wife gets home. I can't keep doing this with you anymore." The space around us seemed to freeze. The pleasant clinking of silverware on porcelain plates inside the dining room stopped completely. My 11-year-old granddaughter looked up, her wide, innocent eyes locking onto her grandfather standing outside on the cold, rain-soaked porch. Leo took a step forward, crossing the threshold, and pointed a finger directly in my face. Every single word he spoke next felt like a rusty nail being driven straight into my chest. I can't support an old, broken-down man forever, Dad. I have my own family to take care of. I stood perfectly still, the freezing coastal wind blowing through my thin canvas jacket, but the cold outside was absolutely nothing compared to the sudden, icy numbness that settled deep within my chest. He thought I had come there, begging for a handout. He thought my old scratched work truck and my salt-stained work clothes were the pathetic signs of a bankrupt, desperate old man. He assumed that because a father didn't flaunt his wealth, didn't wear designer labels, or didn't brag about his bank accounts, he had nothing left to his name. I didn't shout at him. I didn't argue or try to defend myself. A man who has spent his entire life working with architectural blueprints and heavy structural steel understands one thing very clearly. When a support column is already severely damaged, screaming at it won't make it any stronger. Do you really think that's why I came here tonight, Leo? I asked quietly, looking past his pointing finger. Leo scoffed, a bitter, contemptuous smile crossing his face. What else could it possibly be, Dad? Look at you. You're a walking embarrassment. That was the exact sentence that made the last lingering shred of respect I had for my son vanish into the freezing night air. I looked directly into his eyes for several long seconds. I didn't see the little boy I once carried on my shoulders through the muddy shipyard, the boy who used to watch in awe as I launched massive wooden schooners into the bay. I only saw an arrogant, hollow man drowning inside the grand, fragile facade he had built for himself. I bent down, my knees stiff from the cold, and placed the brown envelope on the small slate table beside the front door. "All right," I said softly. "I guess you'll find your answer tomorrow morning." I turned away, my steps slow and deliberate as I walked down the wet stone path. Leo stood in the doorway, clicking his tongue in disgust. He was about to slam the heavy oak door shut, but I stopped on the bottom step and looked back. "Oh, and Leo?" I called out over the sound of the wind. "What now, Dad?" he answered, his voice sharp and incredibly irritably. "You should read page 4 before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," I said calmly. I walked down the driveway, the freezing rain beginning to fall harder, washing the salt spray from the windshield of my old Dodge. I climbed inside, and the familiar, robust roar of the Ram's V8 engine came to life, a comforting hum in the middle of the storm. As I pulled away from the curb, I looked in my rearview mirror. Leo's brightly lit waterfront mansion slowly faded into the swirling coastal fog, a glittering palace built on a foundation of pure sand. Leo had always been deeply ashamed of my work truck. He was ashamed of my rough grease-stained hands, and the smell of sawdust and marine lacquer that followed me wherever I went. My late wife Clara and I had spent nearly 35 years building Vance Marine from the ground up. We started with nothing but a rented slip, a box of hand tools, and a dream. We worked from 5 in the morning until long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. Sweat, fiberglass dust, heavy oak timber, and raw determination raised our 2 children, Leo and Maeve. I wasn't rich in the kind of way people flaunt on social media. I didn't drive 6-figure European sports cars, and I didn't wear diamond-encrusted watches. My wealth was invested in solid, tangible things: a fully paid-off coastal home, secure savings accounts, and several prime commercial maritime rental properties along the harbor. I had always lived far below my means, understanding that true security doesn't need an audience. But Leo never understood that. When he was 18 years old, he had looked at my mud-covered work truck, sighed in deep embarrassment, and said something to me that I would never forget. "Dad, nobody cares how hard you've worked if you still look like you're completely broke." At the time, I had just smiled, patting him on the shoulder, and replied, "That's the great thing about money, son. It doesn't care what I look like." But Leo cared. He was absolutely obsessed with the appearance of success. When he grew up, he started a high-end luxury yacht charter and brokerage consultancy, catering to the wealthiest elite of the East Coast. He bought that expensive modern mansion in the suburbs, drove a sleek imported sports sedan, wore pristine Swiss watches, and married Sutton, a woman accustomed to the upper-class lifestyle. Sutton wasn't a malicious person. She was simply used to luxury and lived in the bubble her wealth created. And Leo always loudly insisted to everyone at dinner parties that he had built his empire entirely on his own, through his sheer unassisted business genius. The truth, however, was that Leo was living on a foundation of wet clay. 3 years ago, Leo's yachting consultancy fell into a catastrophic financial crisis. A major international partner suddenly pulled out of a multi-million-dollar deal. Contracts were abruptly canceled, and he was facing complete, humiliating bankruptcy within a matter of weeks. Leo had come to me, trying desperately to hold on to his fragile arrogance. He claimed the company was only facing a temporary liquidity shortage and needed a massive amount of capital to keep operations afloat. I didn't hand him a bag of cash. That wasn't how I operated. I was a builder. I only repaired broken things if they had a secure, honest structure beneath them. Instead, I worked out a highly specialized financial guarantee with our family's commercial bank to save his company from the brink of collapse. Leo survived the storm. He immediately went back to proudly telling his wealthy friends and business partners that he had weathered the crisis through his exceptional market intuition. He believed the bank had trusted in his brilliant potential. He never once bothered to look at the paperwork or find out whose signature had actually taken on the massive, life-threatening financial risk. For the past 3 years, Leo watched me drive my old Dodge Ram. He saw me living quietly alone in my modest harbor cottage after Clara passed away. He began making assumptions. He assumed I had drained all my life savings on Clara's medical bills. He believed that an old man who didn't spend money on shiny things was an old man whose time had passed, a useless relic of a bygone era. Arrogance had blinded him completely. It made him forget who had actually taught him how to walk. I turned on the truck's heavy wipers, the blades clearing the cold rain from my view. Leo remembered that someone had saved his company 3 years ago. What he had never bothered to find out was whose name was signed on the line that actually saved his life. Leo's deep-seated contempt hadn't appeared out of thin air. It had built up slowly, drop by drop, like cold seawater seeping through the rotting seams of an old wooden hull. After Clara, the beautiful wife who had spent her entire life working by my side, passed away from a sudden illness, Leo's attitude began to shift. At first, the change was very small, almost imperceptible. 1 month after the funeral, he had patted me on the shoulder at the cemetery and said, "Dad, if you need anything at all, just call me. I know you're struggling to keep things together." 3 months later, his tone began to take on a sharper, more patronizing edge. "Dad, you really need to start planning for yourself. You can't keep living in that drafty old cottage forever. It looks bad for my business partners to see my father living like a beachcomber." By the 6th month, his fake polite patience had completely disappeared. One Sunday afternoon, when I stopped by his mansion to drop off some fresh-caught blue crabs for my grandchildren, Leo stood in his expansive kitchen with his arms crossed, looking at me with a weary, heavy sigh. "Dad, my wife and I can't just change our entire family schedule every time you feel a little lonely," he snapped. I stood there in the center of his kitchen, utterly stunned. I had never asked him to leave work to help me. I had never made him come over to clean my cottage. I had never asked him for a single dollar. I had only stopped by because I missed my grandchildren, because the silence in my own home after Clara's death was sometimes deafening. But Leo was busy creating a completely different reality in his mind. He began talking to our relatives, our neighbors, and his high society friends as though he were carrying the massive, exhausting burden of my entire life. At my granddaughter's 10th birthday party last year, the grand house was packed with wealthy guests. I sat quietly in the loft upstairs, enjoying a quiet moment away from the crowd, when I heard Leo talking to a few of his wealthy acquaintances in the backyard below. His voice was filled with the self-important pride of someone enduring a great heroic hardship. "Right now, I practically have to support 2 entire families," Leo sighed loudly, swirling his glass of expensive whiskey. "Between my own household expenses and keeping my dad afloat, everything is just incredibly tight these days. But hey, he's my father. What choice do I have?" One of my cousins, who had heard this rumor, came over to me a few minutes later. He looked at my worn canvas jacket with deep, patronizing pity. "Leo's been helping you out a lot lately with your bills, hasn't he, Garrett?" he asked softly. I looked down at the glass of water in my hand, took a slow sip, and looked back at him. "Apparently so," I replied briefly, keeping my voice flat. That small, poisonous detail pierced my heart deeply, but I chose to stay silent. I wanted to see exactly how far my son was willing to go with his own grand lie. I wanted to see if there was any limit to his greed and his pride. My silence, however, only made Leo even more confident. He assumed that because I was quiet, I was becoming old, weak, and senile. 3 months ago, I was sitting in the guest house of his estate, waiting to pick up Chloe for her sailing lesson, when I accidentally overheard a quiet conversation between him and Sutton through the open window. "His savings are completely gone, Sutton," Leo told his wife, his voice urgent. "He's clinging to that old harbor cottage, but he can't even afford the property taxes anymore. I'm already preparing the legal paperwork to sell his house. As soon as we can prove he's no longer mentally capable of managing his own affairs, we'll move him into a nice, quiet nursing home upstate. It's what's best for everyone." The very next morning, when he stopped by my cottage to pick up an old outboard motor, I looked him straight in the eyes and asked him directly, "Are you planning my future for me, Leo?" Leo wasn't embarrassed or flustered at all. He casually adjusted his expensive tie, looked at his watch, and said, "I'm planning everyone's future, Dad. It's what a successful man does." At that exact moment, a bitter, icy truth washed over me. My son no longer saw me as a father, or even as a human being who had sacrificed his youth to give him a future. He saw me as an asset that hadn't yet been liquidated, a heavy, inconvenient burden that needed to be dealt with and disposed of as quickly as possible. But I wasn't angry. I was a builder. I knew when a vital support column had completely rotted away from the inside. You can't reinforce a column that has been eaten away by termites. You can only prepare yourself for the exact moment it inevitably collapses under its own weight. That was when I decided to review every single one of my financial and legal documents. I called my personal corporate attorney. I stopped wondering whether my son was ashamed of me, and I started wondering exactly what kind of trap he was secretly preparing behind my back. Now, let's go back to that cold, rain-soaked night on the porch where our story began. I hadn't gone to my son's house looking for warmth or a cup of tea or his hollow affection. I had driven there because of an urgent, certified notice I had received from my personal attorney earlier that afternoon. The massive commercial loan that had saved Leo's yachting consultancy from complete bankruptcy 3 years earlier had finally reached its renewal date. The commercial bank required a full, comprehensive review of the collateral and the personal guarantees behind the debt. I had wanted to discuss the matter with Leo privately, as father and son, to see if he had built a solid plan to stand on his own feet. But he hadn't given me the chance. Instead, he had stood on his grand porch in front of his wealthy mother-in-law and his children and shouted, "I can't support an old man forever." His roar had torn through the quiet air of the living room. Victoria, his haughty mother-in-law, had stepped closer to the open door, her fingers glittering with a massive sapphire ring. She looked out at my wet work clothes with a mixture of superficial pity and deep contempt. "Leo has his own children to think about, Garrett," Victoria said, her voice sharp and nasal. "You need to understand the situation." I looked at her, my voice remaining perfectly calm and low. "I know they are my grandchildren, Victoria. I understand the situation perfectly. Then you should do the decent thing and stop making things so incredibly embarrassing for your son," she replied coldly. The entire entryway fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. Leo's face had turned bright red with embarrassment and fury, terrified that his wealthy mother-in-law would think he had a broke, freeloading father clinging to his coattails. "Dad, please. Just stop showing up unexpectedly and making a scene." Leo growled, his voice trembling with rage. I looked past his shoulder. My 11-year-old granddaughter was staring down at her plate, her shoulders hunched as she avoided her grandfather's eyes. That was the moment that truly made my heart ache. It wasn't Leo's profound disrespect, and it wasn't Victoria's cold contempt. I was hurt because my grandchildren were being taught a toxic, poisonous lesson. They were being taught that elderly people become useless burdens the moment they can no longer generate wealth. They were being taught to discard their own family members like worn-out machinery. I didn't try to explain myself. I didn't tell him about the bank notice. I simply placed the brown envelope on the small table and walked out into the freezing rain. As I reached the end of the driveway, Sutton's luxury SUV pulled into the brick-paved parking pad. She had just gotten home from a charity committee meeting. She rolled down her window, gave me a brief, polite nod, and I nodded back before climbing into my old Dodge Ram. Inside the house, Leo had hurried out to greet his wife, taking her wet coat. "Did your dad come begging for money again?" Sutton asked, noticing the tense, quiet atmosphere in the living room. Leo let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, shaking his head with feigned exhaustion. "Yeah, he came asking for another handout. I had to tell him to go home. I can't keep funding his bad decisions." His lie was perfect. He had officially turned me into a desperate beggar in front of his entire family. But Sutton didn't walk straight into the living room. She paused in the hallway, her eyes falling on the brown envelope sitting alone on the slate table. Leo had told everyone that he was supporting me. By 9 o'clock the next morning, he was about to discover the exact, terrifying opposite. The next morning, at exactly 8:50, Leo woke up with a pounding, stress-induced headache. He reached for his phone on the mahogany nightstand, and his heart skipped a beat. The screen showed 4 missed calls from the regional credit director of the Maryland Commercial Bank. Leo jolted upright in bed, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. His company's massive business credit line, the very lifeblood of his luxury yacht consultancy, was due for its triennial reassessment today. Leo had always been completely confident that the bank would automatically renew the agreement. He believed his reputation as a high society businessman was more than enough to secure the credit. He hurried downstairs, the grand house quiet and empty. Sutton had already taken the children to their private academy. On the small slate table beside the front door, the brown envelope was still lying exactly where I had left it. Leo frowned, walked over, and tore open the sealed edge. Inside was a 6-page, highly detailed financial file. Pages 1 through 3 contained his company's actual business figures from 3 years ago, revealing the catastrophic $2 million high-risk debt his consultancy had faced. Leo slowly turned to page 4. His eyes widened in absolute terror, the color draining from his face as his breath caught in his throat. It was a legally binding signed asset guarantee agreement. The collateral that had saved Leo's company from complete liquidation 3 years ago was not his business reputation, and it was not his exceptional talent. It was a $3 million maritime real estate trust that Clara and I had established in our names 20 years earlier. Leo had spent 3 years proudly telling his friends that the bank had recognized his genius. In reality, the bank had only trusted the massive, rock-solid asset standing quietly behind him. My signature was written directly beneath the guarantee clause. Clara's signature was right beside mine. At that exact moment, Leo's phone rang. My name flashed on the digital screen. He answered it instantly, his voice trembling so hard he could barely speak, the arrogant, aggressive tone from the night before completely gone. Dad, what is this?" Leo blurted out, gasping for breath. "Page 4, Leo," I replied calmly, taking a slow sip of my hot coffee as I sat in my quiet home office overlooking the harbor. "I told you to read page 4. You guaranteed the loan for me?" Leo's voice cracked, sounding like a frightened child. "Your mother and I did," I replied, my voice steady and unyielding. A deathly, suffocating silence stretched across the phone line. Leo collapsed onto his expensive designer sofa, his mind spinning as the entire facade of his self-made success crumbled into dust. "Last night, Leo, you stood on your porch and told your entire family that you were supporting me," I said slowly over the speaker, letting every single word sink deep into his conscience. "But for the past 3 years, it has been my hard-earned assets keeping your company alive. You have been living on my sweat and tears." Leo held his breath, realizing the absolute terrifying danger he was in. The asset guarantee was scheduled to officially expire at exactly 5 o'clock this Saturday afternoon. If I didn't sign the renewal paperwork at the bank, the credit line would be instantly terminated, and the bank would immediately freeze every single one of his company's accounts. His entire business would collapse into complete bankruptcy within 48 hours. I had gone to his house the night before to ask him one simple, honest question. Did he have a realistic plan to stand on his own 2 feet? But he had thrown me out into the rain before he could even hear the question. Leo's voice immediately softened, turning into an oily, desperate plea. Dad, last night was just because I've under so much stress with the new contracts. I didn't mean any of it, I swear. I was just stressed." "No, Leo," I interrupted him, my voice cutting through his lies like a sharp chisel. "Last night wasn't stress. Last night was the absolute truth of how you see me. I have spent 35 years building custom boats. Work with wood and metal long enough, and you realize one thing. Cracks don't bring a structure down. Ignoring them does. I didn't withdraw the guarantee immediately. Despite his cruelty, I wasn't the kind of father who wanted to destroy his own son's life just to satisfy an insult. I decided to give him one final, ultimate chance to save himself. Come to my attorney's office at 2 o'clock this afternoon, I ordered, and bring every single one of your company's accounting ledgers." Leo hesitated, his voice tight. What? What are you going to do, Dad?" "I'm giving you a chance to repair the cracks," I replied, and hung up the phone. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Leo arrived at my attorney's office. He was wearing an expensive charcoal gray wool suit, but his face was pale, drawn, and exhausted, with dark purple circles clearly visible beneath his eyes. The reckless, mocking confidence from the night before had completely vanished, replaced by the desperate panic of a man who realized the ground beneath his feet was about to crumble. He walked into the wood-paneled conference room, but froze in absolute shock when he saw his wife, Sutton, already sitting at the table. "Sutton? What are you doing here?" Leo stammered, his eyes darting frantically between her and me. "I invited her, Leo," I replied calmly, sitting at the head of the table with my attorney beside me. "Sutton is your wife, she is the mother of your children, and she has a legal and moral right to know the absolute truth about this family's financial situation." Leo pressed his lips tightly together, a deep, fiery red flush of pure embarrassment spreading up his neck. "This is my business, Dad," he muttered, trying to maintain some shred of his pride. It doesn't involve her. Then you have even less of a reason to lie to her, I replied firmly, my voice echoing in the quiet room. My attorney pushed a thick stack of financial documents across the table toward Leo. I looked my son straight in the eyes, my gaze steady and unyielding. I am not withdrawing my asset guarantee immediately, Leo, I began. I am going to give you a chance to restructure the commercial loan, but only under 5 absolute, non-negotiable conditions. Leo swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the back of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. What conditions, Dad? First, I said, pointing to the ledger, you will fully and honestly disclose your company's actual financial situation to your wife and to me. No more hiding debts, no more secret accounts. Second, you will immediately cut all extravagant, useless spending meant solely for social show. No more leasing luxury sports cars, no more buying 6-figure watches on company credit. Third, you will remove my assets and your late mother's estate from every single future business plan you have. You will never again view my properties as your safety net. Fourth, you will tell Sutton the absolute truth about who has been funding your lifestyle and keeping your consultancy alive for the past 3 years. I paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. My gaze grew incredibly stern. And fifth, you will look your family in the eyes and sincerely apologize for the insulting, cowardly lie you told on your porch last night. Leo's expression underwent a terrifying transformation. The panic in his eyes was suddenly replaced by a wild, irrational fury as his desperate arrogance rose back to the surface. Having to admit in front of his wife that his entire empire of success was a complete sham, that he had been living off his broke father's hard labor, was a crushing, fatal blow to his massive pride. You want me to humiliate myself? Leo shouted, his voice cracking with rage as he slammed his fist onto the table. In front of my wife? In front of everyone? I lightly struck my palm against the polished wood of the table, my voice dropping even lower but carrying a sudden, thunderous weight that made him flinch. No, Leo, I want you to repair the profound humiliation you have already brought upon yourself. Leo shot to his feet, knocking his chair backward. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, venomous hatred. You're just using your money to control me. You've always been jealous of my success, and now you're using this to destroy me. You're threatening my life, my family. I looked at him, my heart breaking but my face remaining as solid as granite. I am not threatening you, Leo. I am simply refusing to continue putting my life's work beneath the feet of a man who tramples on my dignity. If you cannot respect the hands that built your foundation, then you have no right to stand on it. Leo breathed heavily, his chest heaving as he turned toward Sutton, searching desperately for her agreement, for her to defend him. But Sutton wasn't looking at him. She was staring down at the detailed financial ledgers on the table, her eyes wide with absolute shock and horror. The massive hidden debts, the impending bankruptcies, and his complete, embarrassing dependence on my assets were laid bare before her in stark, unyielding black and white. Leo, Sutton whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of deep disappointment and heartbreak. You've been lying to me for 3 years. You told me you built all of this yourself. You told me your father was the one asking us for help. Leo couldn't answer. The shame, the anger, and the exposure of his lies built to an explosive breaking point. He snatched his leather briefcase from the table, spun on his heel, and stormed out of the conference room, slamming the heavy door behind him. He didn't choose to make things right. He chose to run. After storming out of the attorney's office, Leo didn't call the bank to discuss a payment plan. He didn't call me to apologize or negotiate. Instead, he took a far more desperate, despicable path. He decided to use the very sister who had always loved and supported him. He immediately called Maeve, his voice filled with a manufactured theatrical panic as he spun a dark, terrifying new narrative. Maeve, you have to help me. Leo whispered urgently into the phone, pretending to guide his car through traffic. It's Dad. He hasn't been himself lately. I think his mind is slipping. He's making extremely irrational, dangerous financial decisions. Maeve, who was working at her corporate office, frowned in deep concern. What do you mean, Leo? What's wrong with Dad? He's becoming senile. Maeve, Leo lied, his voice a low, manipulative hiss. Ever since Mom died, he's been emotionally unstable, but it's gotten so much worse. Yesterday he came to my house, completely disoriented, and caused a massive, embarrassing scene in front of Victoria and the kids. And today, he called me into his attorney's office and threatened to withdraw every single one of our family's investments and trusts. He wants to liquidate Clara's estate and throw it away. I'm terrified he's going to ruin himself and leave us with nothing. We have to do something. Maeve's heart raced. She loved me, but she was practical, and the thought of her aging father losing his mental grip was her worst nightmare. Leo, are you sure? Dad has always been so sharp. He's hiding it, Maeve. Leo pressed on, narrowing his trap. But the bank called me this morning because he refused to sign a standard renewal form. He's sabotaging my company just to punish me. We need to act fast. We need to get a medical evaluation and apply for a joint power of attorney over his assets before he liquidates everything. It's the only way to protect him from himself. What Leo didn't know was that my corporate attorney, Vivian, had spent 40 years navigating the murkiest waters of contract law. She had security protocols in place, and because she was a close family friend, she kept a very close eye on any legal inquiries regarding my trusts. Within 2 hours of Leo's call to me, Vivian's assistant flagged an urgent request from Leo's personal attorney, asking for the full disclosure of my medical records and trust structures under the guise of estate planning. Vivian called me immediately. Her voice on the line was quiet, professional, but filled with a deep, sorrowful gravity. "Garrett," she said softly, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Leo isn't trying to save his business anymore. He is building a legal case to prove that you are mentally incompetent. He is trying to strip you of your legal rights so he can seize control of your assets and sign the bank guarantee himself." As I sat in the quiet of my harbor cottage, listening to her words, my heart closed completely. Until that exact second, I had still believed my son was simply a foolish, arrogant young man who was blinded by pride and fear. Fear can make people do ugly, desperate things, and as a father I had been willing to forgive his fear. But this was not fear. This was a cold, calculated, ruthless strategy to destroy the very father who had raised him, to lock me away in a padded room just so he could keep driving his sports cars and wearing his Swiss watches. When a custom shipbuilder discovers that a vital hull timber isn't just cracked, but completely infested with dry rot, he doesn't try to patch it or sand it down anymore. He cuts it out of the vessel entirely. "Garrett?" Vivian's voice came through the phone, her tone worried. "Are you sure you want to go through with this? If you don't sign that renewal by Saturday, Leo will be left in an extremely difficult, devastating position. His company will collapse." "He has already made his decision for me, Vivian," I replied, my voice low, calm, and completely devoid of any anger. "Prepare the final documents. I will meet you on Saturday." I invited everyone who had been present on the cold porch the night I was humiliated to return to Leo's house on Saturday evening. Leo had eagerly agreed to gather everyone. In his arrogance, he believed I was finally preparing to surrender. He thought that his malicious campaign to spread the rumor of my senility had created enough pressure to break me, and that a father would always choose to preserve the family's public dignity over his own pride. Victoria sat in the corner of the grand designer sofa, her posture rigid and her face unreadable. Sutton sat quietly beside her, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Maeve stood leaning against the towering glass window, looking at me with a mixture of deep anxiety and guilt. My grandchildren had been sent up to their rooms. Leo stood in the center of the grand, marble-floored living room. He had a smug, triumphant smile on his face as he casually adjusted his Patek Philippe watch. "Dad." Leo spoke first, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm really glad you've finally realized what is best for this family. We don't need to make things any more complicated than they already are. Just sign the bank papers, and we can put all of this unpleasantness behind us." I sat down in the leather armchair across from him. I placed a thick black leather folder of documents on the low glass coffee table between us. "This is not a negotiation, Leo," I said, my voice quiet, flat, and completely steady. Leo frowned, his smile faltering slightly. "Then what is this? A family meeting to put me on trial?" "A truth that needs to be made absolutely clear," I replied, opening the folder. I looked directly at Victoria, then turned towards Sutton and Maeve. 3 years ago, Leo's yachting consultancy was on the absolute verge of complete, humiliating bankruptcy, I began, my voice clear and carrying to every corner of the high-ceilinged room. He had a high-risk debt of nearly $2 million, and not a single commercial bank in the state of Maryland would agree to lend him a single dime. His credit rating was completely dead. Leo's face changed instantly, turning a mottled, furious red as he took a rapid step forward. "Dad, stop bringing up old dead history. That has nothing to do with tonight." I raised my calloused hand, a silent, commanding gesture that cut him off. "Your late mother, Clara, and I used every single asset we had accumulated over 35 years of back-breaking labor to sign a personal, $3 million guarantee for his loan. Clara told me one thing on her deathbed, Leo. She said, 'Let Leo believe he saved himself. His confidence will help him become the strong, successful man he wants to be.' So I kept that secret for 3 years." Victoria's eyes widened in pure shock. She turned toward Leo, her mouth slightly open. Sutton simply lowered her head. She had already learned the devastating truth in my attorney's office. After Clara died, I kept my promise to her, I continued, looking directly into my son's shifting, panicked eyes. I drove my old Dodge. I wore my salt-stained work clothes. I lived in my modest cottage, and I let Leo proudly believe he was a brilliant, self-made millionaire. Until last Sunday night. That night, on your porch in front of my grandchildren and your mother-in-law, you looked at me and said, "I can't support an old, broken-down man forever." A cold bead of sweat rolled down Leo's temple. He swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he tried to backpedal. "Dad, I was just under a lot of pressure. I didn't mean." "You were absolutely right, Leo," I interrupted him, my voice cutting through his defense like iron. "You were never supporting me. You have never given me a single cent of your wealth. And starting at exactly 5 o'clock this afternoon, I am officially no longer supporting your fake fragile life either." I pulled out the certified, stamped notice from the Maryland Commercial Bank and placed it on the glass table. At 4:30 today, I officially delivered my written refusal to renew the asset guarantee. The bank has terminated your credit line. I am not taking your company away from you, Leo. I am not taking a single dollar from your pockets. I am simply refusing to allow my wife's and my blood, sweat, and tears to fund your ungrateful, arrogant lifestyle any longer. Leo went stark white. He lunged toward the table, his face contorted in a mask of pure animalistic rage as he roared, "You're going to destroy my company. You're going to ruin my life. How could you do this to your own son?" I stood up, pulling my old canvas oilskin duster over my shoulders. I looked down at my only son, my voice dropping into a calm, unyielding tone that was as flat and cold as the winter sea. "No, Leo. If my signature was the only thing keeping your grand company alive, then your company was never actually standing on its own. It was a ghost. And it's time for you to face the reality of what you've built." Sutton looked up, her voice trembling as she asked the single, devastating question. "Leo, how much money do we actually owe without his guarantee?" Leo fell into a complete, suffocating silence. He couldn't answer her. He couldn't look her in the eyes. I walked toward the heavy front door, the solid oak handle cold in my hand. "That is a question you will have to ask your husband, Sutton," I said softly, and walked out into the cool, silent night. There was no sudden magical miracle that could save Leo's yachting consultancy after that Saturday night. His fake, extravagant life began to crack and shatter, piece by piece, exactly like a grand ship whose single load-bearing hull timber had been violently ripped out. Within 2 weeks, the bank officially froze his commercial accounts, and his international partners withdrew their remaining contracts. Leo was forced to face the harsh, unyielding reality of his debts. He was forced to sell his sleek imported sports sedan, liquidate his investment portfolios, and downsize his lifestyle completely. Sutton, showing a quiet resilience I had always respected, stood by him on one condition, that they move out of the multi-million-dollar waterfront mansion and into a modest, rented cottage near the harbor. 4 months later, a light, freezing drizzle was falling over the bay. I was standing in the dry dock of my old shipyard, wiping down a newly restored wooden sailboat. When I heard the squeak of the rusty iron gate, I looked up. Standing in the drizzle, his collar turned up against the cold wind, was Leo. He looked entirely different from the arrogant, polished young man who had thrown me out of his mansion 4 months earlier. He was wearing a simple, faded canvas jacket. His hands were red and slightly calloused from actual labor, and his face was lined with the exhaustion of a man who had spent the last several weeks working 14-hour days to pay off his debts. He looked very much like I had 30 years ago, when Clara and I were first struggling to keep Vance Marine alive. He stood on the gravel path, the rain dripping from the brim of his cap. "Dad, can I come in?" Leo asked quietly, his voice carrying a soft, genuine humility I hadn't heard since he was a little boy. I looked at him, my heart aching but my mind remaining clear. "Did you come here because you need money, Leo?" I asked. Leo slowly shook his head, looking down at his worn leather boots. "No, Dad. I sold the waterfront house, I downsized the consultancy, and I've been working as a marine surveyor to pay off the remaining bank debts myself. I don't want a single dollar from you. I just came to talk." I stepped aside, gesturing toward the warm wood-paneled office inside the hangar. "Then come inside, Leo." We sat down in the quiet office, the smell of fresh oak shavings and hot coffee filling the air. Leo looked around the room, taking in the old, faded photographs of Clara and me standing proudly on the decks of the ships we had built. This time, there was not a single trace of contempt, shame, or embarrassment in his expression. "I am so sorry, Dad," Leo said, his voice quiet, raw, and coming from the absolute bottom of his heart. "I was so blinded by my own arrogance. I looked down on the very things you and Mom built with your hands, and I treated you like an embarrassment. I was a coward. I didn't tell him that what he had done was okay, because it wasn't. The humiliation I had felt in front of my grandchildren, and his ruthless attempt to have me declared mentally incompetent, could not be erased by a single simple apology. I hear you, Leo, I replied gently, pouring him a mug of black coffee. And I appreciate your words, but respect is like a ship's hull. Once it's been cracked, you don't just patch it with a quick coat of paint and call it seaworthy. You have to rebuild it timber by timber through consistent, honest action. Leo nodded, a single, silent tear escaping his eye as he took the hot mug. I know, Dad, and I'm ready to do the work. I want to build a real foundation this time. As I watched my son walk out of the shipyard gate that evening, his shoulders slightly hunched against the cold rain, but his steps firm and purposeful, I realized three profound lessons about life, family, and boundaries that I want to share with you today. Lesson number 1. Never confuse silence with peace. In many families, people don't argue not because they are genuinely happy, but because one person has chosen to remain silent, swallowing their own pain and swallowing their own pride to keep the peace. But patient silence never changes a toxic, arrogant person. It only gives them more opportunities to escalate their disrespect. Sometimes, you have to let the structure fall so you can see what is actually worth rebuilding. Lesson number 2. The source of a person's pain explains their behavior, but it never excuses their responsibility. Leo had been carrying a deep-seated resentment about my absence during his childhood, which explains his anger, but it does not excuse his cruelty, his lies, or his attempt to destroy his own father. A person is only truly ready to heal when they dare to face the truth, admit their mistakes, and set clear, honest boundaries. And lesson number 3. Forgiving someone and allowing them back into your life are two completely different things. I can forgive my son, and I can let go of the anger in my heart. But that does not mean I will ever allow him to put his hands on my life's work again. Forgiveness is about freeing your own soul. Boundaries are about protecting your peace of mind from being destroyed a second time. The old green Dodge Ram is still parked in my driveway, its engine running as strong as ever. My family is beginning to heal slowly, timber by timber, but we are building on a foundation of absolute truth this time. And those scars we carry, they are not signs of weakness. They are the unyielding proof that we survived the storm. If this story touched your heart, or reminded you of someone who stood by you and protected you when you were at your weakest, feel free to share it with them. And if you enjoy stories where the truth always finds its way home, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Thank you for joining Whispered Truths. Leave a comment with the number 5 in your beautiful city so I know you made it all the way to the end. I'll see you in our next story.